and you have New Jerusalem. But we're focusing today mostly on Old Jerusalem, and Old Jerusalem is a unique place because within a very small space you have very sacred spaces for three religions, for Judaism, for Christianity, and Islam. So we're looking here at what's called the Western Wall, or in Hebrew, the Kotel HaMaravi, and this is the retaining wall that's was built 2,000 years ago by King Herod the Great in the New Testament, in order to enlarge the precinct of the Holy Temple. So the Holy Temple is destroyed by the Romans on the 9th day of Av in the year 70, and the retaining walls around it are left. And for various reasons, the Western Wall became associated with the place that Jews pray at instead of the temple, because every day we pray 3 times that the temple will be rebuilt. So what happened here is after the 9th day of Av in the year 70, the Roman legionnaires would get up every morning, have their cappuccino, and proceed to knock the stones down from this huge compound. And as they did that, they filled up the valley with the stones. So what we see today is only a third of the height of this very high wall. It's said that in the Talmud, with some hyperbole, that 10 measures of beauty were given to Jerusalem, to the world, and 9 of them were taken up by Jerusalem. This was an extraordinary building for 2,000 years ago. This was the Taj Mahal. And again, what we're looking at, the people are standing on ground level that's been raised up substantially after the Romans filled in the valley by knocking the stones down. We'll move to the next slide, please. Okay, so on top of that compound, which is called by the Jewish people the Temple Mount, and by Muslims it's called the Haram Sharif, the noble sanctuary, it's a mountain. So there's a rock at the peak of the mountain, and on top of the peak is where the rock is, the crest of the hill, is what's called the Dome of the Rock, the building with the golden dome. It's an octagonal building. I have to say it's not a mosque, it's a shrine. And according to Jewish tradition, this is where Abraham brings his son Isaac. And he's no longer a boy, he's a grown man. He's the same age as Jesus will be when he's sacrificed. And he ties him up there on the rock, and he's ready. He's got a knife in his hand, and he's ready to sacrifice him in Genesis 12. And at the very last minute, an angel says, don't even touch him, don't even nick him. So this becomes the site of the temple. A whole bunch of things happen there. The first temple is built by King Solomon about the year 960 before the Common Era, BCE, and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. And then it's rebuilt, and again, that second temple is destroyed in the year 70 of this era, the Common Era. So let's keep moving along. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so the building is covered with these beautiful tiles. They're from Armenia, or more to the point, they're from Armenian tile makers who, in 1915, the world has such a horrible history. As World War I is advancing, the Ottoman Empire decides it's going to purge the empire of all people who aren't Muslim, and they perpetrate a genocide, a huge massacre of some 1.5 million Armenian Christians. And some of the survivors moved to Jerusalem, and they've been making tiles on the Silk Road from China to Europe for many, many centuries, and they're the ones who repair the tiles that we see today, these 4 Armenian families. Next tile, please. Next tile, next slide. Okay, so we've seen the Jewish site, we've seen the Muslim site, and that, of course, is where Muhammad ascends to heaven, to the 7th heaven. But the third site, and all these are very close together, is what's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the place where Jesus has He's been convicted of sedition, and he's sent to the Roman execution grounds. And we can see in the brown and white, brown and gold, the nature of the hill. There's a cave or a sepulcher that's quarried out, and Jesus is placed in there. Jewish people don't bury people on the Sabbath. They don't bury the dead on the Sabbath. Jesus is executed on a Friday, and just before the Sabbath, he's placed in the tomb. We see it's called the alleged site of Christ's tomb. That was a brand new sepulcher or cave carved out for Joseph of Arimathea, and he donates it. Jesus is buried there, and then 3 days later, the stone that blocks the entrance to the tomb has been moved aside, and the tomb is empty. So what's happened here is, in the 3 centuries after this is about the year 34 of the Common Era, Constantine converts the Roman Empire, the pagan empire, into the Byzantine or Christian Empire, and he sends his mama, Queen Helena, to Jerusalem. She identifies all of these sites, and they quarry away the hill, and with the stones they build an enormous church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, again on the site that's called Golgotha or Skull Hill. Okay, next slide. Okay, so needless to say, Jesus was not the first person to be buried in Jerusalem. The whole city is an enormous cemetery, and many of the tombs are quite elaborate and quite ancient. So the world's oldest and largest Jewish cemetery is on the Mount of Olives. That's what we're looking at. And we're on the right, the pyramid structure. That's the tomb of Absalom, except it's not. Because many things in Jerusalem are they're based on tradition, but they're not based on history. It's a Roman era tomb, and it's entirely possible that it's a tomb of King Herod's son, Herod Agrippus, but we don't know. So again, that's the Kidron Valley, that's part of the Mount of Olives Jewish Cemetery. And in the upper right, we see many tombstones. People are buried, well, in the ground, and then there's a horizontal tombstone placed on top of their grave site. By the way, in Israel, like in India, of course, we pay taxes, and your taxes do include a tomb. But if you want to be a grave site, if you want to be buried on the Mount of Olives, it's going to cost you a lot more. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so there on the right side, we see a view of the Mount of Olives Jewish Cemetery. And in the center and on the left, we see, again, not the western wall, but the southern wall of Herod's huge Temple Mount. And where the gray dome is, that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the furthest mosque. In the Quran, the word Jerusalem never appears, but Muhammad is said to have gone from the closest mosque to the furthest mosque. And he's said to have done this on his winged horse, Al-Burak. So this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And below it, we see ruins of palaces that were built using the stones salvaged from the stones that the Romans had knocked down. Because everywhere you go in Jerusalem, you're going to see stones in secondary usage. Why bother to quarry stones when you have perfectly good, much older stones that you can pillage? Next slide, please. If anyone has any questions, please answer. Okay, so the Jewish people, we lose our country, the state of Israel, and it goes through many different rulers, but the Jewish people never lose our hope. In Hebrew, the tikva, the hope that we will have our country returned, that we will regain our country. And in 1948, this dream becomes fruition. Unfortunately, the United Nations in 1947 votes to partition Palestine, just as Britain partitions India into Pakistan and India. So they want to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and the Arabs refuse, and the Jews buy World War II surplus weapons, and we have what we Israelis call the War of Independence, but for the Arabs living in Palestine, they call this the disaster, the Nakba, the War of Independence. Many of the people who fought here, by the way, especially in the more high-tech units like the Air Force, they're World War II veterans, many of them Jewish, but not all of them, from various foreign countries, such as Canada, South Africa, the United States, and Britain, etc. If anyone has questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, the next...
Gil, we'll do questions at the end once you finish the presentation.
Okay, good. So the next slide. Okay, so I spoke about Al-Burak, Muhammad's winged horse. So what we see here, and of course Muslims never depict Muhammad, but we see Al-Burak, the winged horse. At the bottom, we see the Dome of the Rock, where Muhammad ascends to heaven. And at the top, the green dome, this is in Mecca. So he's gone from the closest mosque to the furthest mosque. Next slide. So, you know, we talk about history, or I've been talking a lot about history, but I think it's important to remember Jerusalem's a living city. And for the last 2,000, this is a pigeon, a dove, but for the last 2,000 years, birds called swifts have made their nests in the Western Wall because they liked the cliff aspect of it. They never land on the ground. And so, yeah, Jerusalem is a living city with, you know, real people, with garbage man and all the problems of real modern cities. Next slide. But just to put in a frame of reference, we can never get away from history. We saw a real pigeon. Does anybody know what we're looking at here? Okay, well, it's on the continuation of the Mount of Olives, is Mount Scopus. And in the 19th century, all the European powers are competing in this, what they call the Great Game. Britain has got the Raj, and France has taken Algeria, and Italy's taken Libya. And one of the biggest prize of all is the Holy Land, a place where there are no ports, no rivers, no railroads, no gold mines, no nothing. But here you have, for Christians, the prestige of the Holy Land. This is the German Imperial Eagle, built in a building by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. He names it after his wife, Augusta Victoria. And a story tour guides like to tell is that he hoped that when Palestine became in the future a German colony, that this would be the colonial headquarters. So there's the German Imperial Eagle, a symbol of Germany's dashed hopes for world conquest in Jerusalem. Next.
Joel, you've gone on mute. Gil, you're on mute. You'll have to just unmute yourself and start again for this slide. You'll have to unmute. Gil, you're on mute. You need to unmute.
Yes. There we go. Okay, I'm sorry. So this huge compound, the Temple Mount, the Haram Sharif, has a series of gates. And on the east side, no, stay there. Yes, that's the Golden Gate. And in the future, because we're always in many dimensions, the past, the present, and the future, all at the same time, when the Messiah comes, returns, whatever you believe, he'll enter through that gate. So the Muslims block up the gate. And moreover, they put a cemetery, which we see in the foreground in front of it, a Muslim cemetery, under the mistaken idea that the Messiah will be from the priestly caste, and priests aren't supposed to go into cemeteries. The Messiah will not be a priest, I assure you. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if we're simultaneously in the past, the present, and the future, we're also simultaneously at ground level and below ground. And this, we're looking at the street level. These are 2,000-year-old paving stones. That's the Roman street, the Herodian street, beside Herod's enormous Temple Mount. And today it's underground. And the reason I said is that, again, the Romans knocked down stones from Herod's compound, and they raise up the ground level. But since 1967, when Israel recaptured, just a minute, please. Richard, I can't talk. I'll call you back. Since it's 1967, when Israel reunited the divided city of Jerusalem, it was like Berlin, East Berlin, West Berlin, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. We've had enormous archaeological excavations, and today you can walk along this Herodian street, deep underground, with these support pillars above you. Go ahead, next slide. Next slide. Okay, so Jerusalem originally, going back some 4,000 years, is it's part of the Canaanite world, and there are different tribes of Canaanites. There's one that's called the Jebusites, and they have their city is located where it is because there's a water source, a spring, which we'll get to, the Gihon spring, but the city gets captured by King David around the year 1000 BCE. He, of course, builds his royal palace. His son Solomon builds the temple. But Solomon's son says, oh, you think my father had heavy taxes? I'm going to make the taxes even heavier. And the 10 northern tribes, there are 12 tribes of Israel, they separate into the kingdom of Israel. And the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is full of all kinds of animosity between the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, and the northern kingdom. And that rivalry lasts for some 2 centuries. But then the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, is destroyed by the Assyrians, coming from today's Iraq. And they deport the people, that's the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But some of the survivors flee south, and they're refugees who come to Jerusalem. And King Hezekiah, this is around the year 700 and something, he builds a wall, a broad wall, the Bible says, to enclose a new suburb that the refugees are living in. So this was revealed after 1967. And on top of this huge wall, of course, there would have been, I suspect, a mud brick wall as well. It would have been very difficult. And the importance of this is where this wall was. Outside of it would have been 7 centuries later, the Roman execution grounds where Jesus would have been executed. Next slide, please. Okay, another view of today, the current Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you'll notice immediately in front of it is a mosque, the Mosque of Omar, and the minaret of the mosque, how does this sound, guys, is deliberately taller than the dome of the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because this is, if you wish, Muslim triumphalism. They want to show that Allah, that Muhammad is bigger than Jesus. Next slide. Okay, so according to Christian tradition, so Jesus comes before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, the procurator, and he's tried for sedition, and he's convicted, he's whipped, a crown of thorns is placed on his head, and he's given this cross. Now here we see a cross. I have to shatter your stereotypes. Jesus did not carry a cross. He only carried the cross beam because the post was waiting at the place that I called Skull Hill or Golgotha, the Roman execution grounds. So in the Middle Ages, a series of places are invented. They're called the Stations of the Cross, along what's called in Latin the Via Dolorosa, the Way of the Sorrows. And every Friday, Catholic or Christian pilgrims carry a cross along the 14 stations that are associated with Jesus' agony until he finally is executed and buried in the sepulcher in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Next slide. Okay, so back to the future. You know, if Jesus is the king, what about the other king? Elvis. This is our city. This is the amazing quality of Israel. There's a place called the Elvis Inn. It's a hamburger joint, and the guy's got one of the world's great collections of Elvis memorabilia. the hamburgers are pretty good too. And every year on Elvis's birthday, there's a great rockin' party, and all of Israel's Elvis impersonators come here and celebrate. So I don't want you to think that Jerusalem is only history. In history, it's a real modern city. Again, I referred to the dove, but with all kinds of contemporary concerns. Next slide. Okay, so we're back inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So this is an 8th century old building. In the year 1009, a nut bar, there's so many Middle East nut bars, named Al-Hakim, he has the bright idea he's going to take the pyramids down in Cairo, stone by stone. After a year, he gives up. He made a small dent. But he orders this building to be demolished. And this leads to, by the year 1095, the Pope Urban in Rome orders a crusade to liberate the Holy Land. And the Crusaders arrive in 1099, and they build the current building. So it's actually a building that's always being renovated. We're in an earthquake zone, and the last big earthquake was 1927, and there was a danger the building would collapse. But the various church denominations, Christian denominations, managed to agree on establishing a committee of engineers to prevent the building's collapse. Next slide.
Wait, I think he's asking you something.
Yes. Go ahead. Is there a question?
We'll take the question at the end. That's okay. You can just finish uninterrupted.
Okay. So walls are, the Crusaders have arrived, and there's 2 centuries of warfare between the Crusaders and the Arabs. And finally, the Crusaders are driven out in 1291, and Jerusalem is left barren. The walls are demolished, and for centuries. And then in the year 1517, the Ottoman Turks captured Jerusalem, and the Caliph, Suleiman the Magnificent, one night has a nightmare that he's being attacked by lions, and he asks his viziers, what does it mean? And he's told the holy city of Jerusalem is lying barren, and he orders the walls built. And of course, where the walls are, there's going to be a fort, and they name it, because everything here is a historical jumble, after King David. So it's the Tower of David, but really it's an Ottoman fort that remains in use until 1967 as a military position. And then after the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel turns it into the Museum of the History of Jerusalem. Many, many museums here, I have to say. You could go to a museum every day for months, a different museum. Next slide. Okay, so Suleiman the Magnificent, I love this story. He commemorates his dream of being attacked by lions by incorporating these animals into one of the gates. It's called the Lion's Gate, but I have to tell you, if you look closely, they're not lions, they're cheetahs. And he salvaged stones, because that's the way it goes in Jerusalem, from a Mamluk emperor named Baibars. His symbol was the cheetahs, and he's just incorporated those stones secondhand into his dream of being attacked by lions at the Lion's Gate. Next slide. Okay, that's the Jaffa Gate, one of the big gates. And again, there's 7 gates that are open, and the Golden Gate, which we saw, is sealed. Next slide. Okay, so the British are here. You'll see these mailboxes in Mumbai, I'm sure. And these are mailboxes on the main street, Jaffa Road, near my house, left over from the British Mandate. Next slide. Okay, we're back in the old city. This gives us an idea of the scale of King Herod's city. That column, that's enormous. That's one of the columns from King Herod's monumental work, and in the background is a building that's called Rothschild House, built in the 19th century in the Jewish quarter. So what we have here is a nice Roman city. The Romans love symmetry. They have an east-west street, that's the Decumanus, and a north-south street, the Cardo, and they meet in the Forum, And then on top of this nice, neat Roman city is the jumble of the medieval Islamic city. Think of the old city of Delhi. So that leaves us with four quarters. We have the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Jewish quarter, and the Armenian quarter. And again, this slide is in the Jewish quarter. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So the weather here, well, it's really quite pleasant. It's a very long, dry summer, 8 or 9 months. It doesn't rain, and a very short, brief, rainy season. It might even snow once every 2 or 3 years. So we're looking at the Kidron Valley, and we see a series of retaining walls, and of course, olive groves. And so in the winter, all of this is very lovely and green. But in the summer, because there's no rain, it all turns brown. Next slide. Okay. Beginning in the 19th century, I mentioned all these European powers are interested in establishing a colonial presence in the land of Israel and Palestine. But as well, the Jewish people are also returning. And one of them is the original dot-com millionaire. His name is Sir Moses Montefiore from London. And he visits here, and he says it's just horrible. It's poverty and slums and disease. And he encourages Jews to move outside of the old city by building the first neighborhood in the wilderness, really. And he envisions it as an agricultural colony. And they're going to grow wheat and grind it on with his windmill, Montefiore's windmill. Next. Okay. In the new city, we have, of course, many supermarkets, but my wife likes to shop at the food market, the outdoor food market, the Machne Yehuda market. This is typical of Jerusalem. We see a gentleman on the left side. He's an ultra-Orthodox Jew, wearing his regular clothing with his fedora. So many people here wear clothing that's distinct. Let's leave it that way. Their clothing identifies who they are. Next slide. Okay. So, in this process of building, of colonization, the Russians are here too. And this is, it's not Moscow. This is the Church of Mary Magdalene. And to give you an illustration of how complicated the history of Jerusalem is, the grandmother of Prince Charles, the Crown Prince of Britain, is buried here. Princess Alice of Greece. And during the Holocaust and World War II, when the Nazis occupy Greece, she hides Jews. She's considered to be one of the 22,000 righteous among the nations, and she wished to be buried here in the tomb in the Church of Mary Magdalene. Next. Okay, so it's an earthquake zone, and we're looking at reinforcements placed on ancient buildings to prop them up so they don't collapse. And as well, people have electricity, and they just attach the wires, like in India, to the outside of buildings. So it's both beautiful and ugly at the same time. I think that's a metaphor for Jerusalem. Next slide. Okay, the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows in Latin, and you'll notice what's happened here is we have a sign, an original sign made by the Armenian sign makers after the British arrive, and at some point the Jordanians removed the Hebrew, and then after 1967 the top row of Hebrew is re-added. So many signs in Israel and Jerusalem are in English, in Arabic, and in Hebrew. Government signs in particular. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, the city I said is reunited in the Six-Day War, and here we have this iconic photograph of these paratroopers. They're just awestruck, standing in front of the Western Wall, and Jews haven't been able to visit there for 19 years. And one of the reasons that the photographer David Rubinger has this unusual photo angle is the street is just a little alleyway. The area today, which we saw, is a huge square in the middle of a dense city, but that was all bulldozed in 1967 and made into a flat space. But here they are in the original area, just a tiny alleyway, and Rubinger can't even step back to get a perspective on them. So he has to squat down. Next slide. Okay, the Dome of the Rock again. I think we've seen that one twice now. Next. Next slide. Okay, so in the center, we see the Church of Mary Magdalene, but in the front at the bottom, in the lower left corner, we see the Church of All Nations and the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus has come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And there are 3 pilgrimage festivals in the ancient world that millions of people would come at Passover, at Tabernacles, and at Pentecost. And he's staying with his friends Mary and Elizabeth. The last night they have the Passover dinner, that's the Last Supper. And then they go back to this, if you have a hill of, a mountain of olive trees, so you have an olive oil press. So this is the Mount of Olives, and the Garden of Gethsemane means the garden of the olive oil press. And there Jesus, he asks his followers, stay with me, pray with me, but they're all drunk. They've all had 4 glasses of wine, maybe 4 bottles of wine, and they just pass out. And Jesus rebukes them, get up. But in the end, of course, Jesus is deserted by all of his male followers. Peter, he denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. So the Romans under Pontius Pilate, they're looking to arrest Jesus. They don't have a photograph, of course. And the traitor Judas Iscariot says, the person who I give a kiss to, that's the kiss of death. That's the guy to arrest. And a sword fight breaks out. Jesus, one of the followers of Jesus, lops off the ear of a Roman soldier. Jesus does his last miracle. He touches the Roman soldier's ear, and it's miraculously healed. And off he goes to meet Pontius Pilate to be tried. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so we saw the 3 soldiers standing in this narrow alleyway. This gives you an idea how big that square is. And again, hundreds of thousands of people come often to the Western Wall for various events. Friday night, every Friday night is a huge celebration to welcome the Sabbath Queen. And we see the gold dome just above to the left. So all this is side by side in the jumble of the old city. A fascinating place. I don't think there's anywhere else on the planet that has so many religious shrines in so close an area. If you think of Varanasi, so the Muslims, they tore down Hindu shrines and built mosques, but here we have mosques, churches, and synagogues all side by side. It's extraordinary. Next slide, please. So one of the competitors to the Rotary Club is the YMCA, and this is arguably the world's fanciest YMCA from the 1920s. And there's a swimming pool and a cultural center, and this is one of the few places where Palestinians and Israelis meet on a kind of a neutral territory, because the city's really bifurcated. It's separated into the Hebrew-speaking Jewish side and the Arabic-speaking Muslim side. And as well, there's a third section where people speak Yiddish, ultra-Orthodox Jews. So there's 3 cities all transposed on each other. Next slide. But it's a modern city. And what we're looking at here is a bridge by an architect engineer named Santiago Calatrava. And the light rail, the tram line, goes over this bridge because the traffic jams are endless, and so the tram has its own right of way. Next slide. And there's the tram. So I live on that tram line in a building built in 1886. And again, we see the older buildings and the modern buildings. That's the reality of the new city of Jerusalem. Many, many tall buildings and many more under construction. Next slide. Okay, Friday afternoon, the city gets quieter and quieter, the Jewish city, and then in the late afternoon, as the sun is setting, a siren sounds for a minute from this building. It's called the ZOHAR building, and today everybody has a watch. You can buy a watch for, 1,000 rupees. You can get a nice watch. But not so long ago, a watch was expensive. So when you heard the siren, you knew you had 18 minutes to complete whatever you were doing, and then the Sabbath would begin. And many, many people take all this very seriously. Everything shuts down for the Sabbath. There aren't too many restaurants open. All the stores are closed. Again, in the West City, in the East Side, everything's open. And this is the ground zero. Next. Next slide. Okay, so guys, I was going to stop here. Time's up. But if you like, I've got some more slides. Do you prefer I continue, or do you want to ask questions?
Vicky, you can show the next slide.
Okay, we'll continue. Fine. Next.
Vicky, yeah.
Whenever you want me to.
Yeah, just show the next slide, Vicky, anyway. Yeah, that's all we have, Gil.
Okay, very good. Okay? I think Joel wants to say a few words, but before he does, I just want to say, in this very rich history, there's also an Indian legacy, and Jerusalem has what's called a Zawiya Hindi, or an Indian hospice. It's in the Muslim quarter, and here during the time of the Raj, Muslims came to this Sufi shrine, and it's a rest house. So they have concerts there, and there's an Indian connection. The other Indian connection is one I'm not so proud of, but it's nothing to do with me really. In World War I, the British, they're fighting the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. And the British have sent troops from India, and they come and they liberate Ottoman Palestine. But the British are so racist, they won't bury the Indian dead in the same cemeteries that they're burying the British soldiers. So you have here in Jerusalem an Indian cemetery from World War I, as well as a British military cemetery from World War I. I think Joel wants to say a few words, please.
Sure, that will be a pleasure.
Take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Gil.
Thank you, Joel.
One of the thoughts that I had as Gil was sharing, Jewish history goes back 5,000 years, 6,000 years. The first Jew was Abraham 4,000 years ago. And putting all of what Gil said into some sort of timeline and structure is not always so easy to do. So there are many books out that simply show the timeline, and correlating the timeline here with the timeline in Indian history or other histories is very important to do. So one of the things that happens from being in Jerusalem is that putting all this together is not always so easy. And it made me a bit admire the Indian culture. A temple for Shiva, a temple for Kali in different places. Here it really is all built one on top of the other, and it's not always easy to do. One thing that we hope for, and it's in our daily prayers, is some sort of ordering of all this that will bring more peace. So, for example, this are the ancient temple spices that were used. And thousands of years ago, just like in India, there was kind of a morning puja, an afternoon puja, and an evening puja. And that hasn't happened for 2,000 years. It could be that one day we will have such a type of a thing, but you can see that remnants of the culture that once existed have shown up in different places in the world, or those types of rituals were borrowed and shared. And that was just one I wanted to mention. The temple spices, these are 13 spices that were burnt that had a smell that was so pleasant that it went over the whole city and everybody became unified. And I'm sure that you experienced that a bit in India. So it's one of my hopeful prayers is that all of the different parts will come together as the world comes together.
Thank you. So Joel and I would like to invite questions, please.
Thank you, Joel. That was really interesting. I mean, we all know Jerusalem being a historic holy place, and I'm a Bohra, that's Muslim. So I know because we travel, when we go to Cairo and Misr, we travel there to Baitul Muqaddas. And as you said, Prophet Muhammad used to face the Masjid Aqsa to pray namaz, and then he shifted it to Masjid Haram, to Mecca. So really it was, I mean, I could really relate to what you were talking, but let me invite questions from our members.
May I ask a question, Dorothy?
Who's that? Is that Mr.
Jankar, I think. Jankar, welcome, Jankar.
Jankar.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Joel and Jill. I have been a great admirer of Jerusalem and the history of Middle East. And I have personally visited Israel 4 times and seen every part of every city, especially a great amount of admiration for Jerusalem. Adding a little bit to what Abu just now said was that Al-Aqsa was a salah or a kind of a mosque which had its importance much before the mosque in Mecca came into picture. Because that is where it is said that Al-Buraq, that the mythical horse Muhammad was traveling on, he got his Jannah, he went to the 7 heavens, etc., etc. So it's a great thing to know that in a small pact of 1 square kilometer, which is Jerusalem Old City, you have point boilers of 3 different magnificent religions. One is the Judaism, the second is Christianity, and the third is Islam. And they are living together. There are, of course, 4 quarters in the city, but somehow there is an element of peace that prevails, and that is a learning point from Jerusalem. Yes, of course, it's always a pot boiler because if there is a spark on any grounds that can happen, it can happen at the same time. But thank you very much for taking us through the journey of Via Dolorosa, the Olive Mount, and so on and so forth. There is so much to talk about it in such a short period of time, and you've done some justice to it, Joel. So thank you very much for visiting our club. And if I believe Joel is a Rotarian, so I would like to convey my greetings to Rotarian Shaul Diagnale, the past district governor, whom I was constantly in touch with when I sent 7 farmers from our country to Israel only to learn agri-techniques. So thank you very much, Joel, for visiting.
Thank you, Shankar. Any questions from Midtowners?
Gil, if I may ask, yeah, this is not on history of Israel. I just wanted to know, we've heard so much about the agriculture that Israel has actually initiated, and it's supposed to be one of the most advanced technologies. Do you have anything that you can tell us about how you do this?
Tell us something about kibbutz. Tell us something about kibbutz.
Yeah, that too. Kibbutz too, yes.
Water and then kibbutz. So
yeah.
in the Eastern Mediterranean, we're on the edge of the desert. I told you it only rains here in a good year for 3 or 4 months. Sometimes the rains don't come and you have a drought. So the population keeps increasing here, and as a result, Israel was forced to become the world's leader in water desalination. #1 in the world in desalination. Today we're free. We take the salt water from the Mediterranean and we make it into drinking water, and we recycle gray water, and really we're free of rain. So this high-tech approach to agriculture is expressed in many things, but a symbol of Israel is drip irrigation. You have a pipe and with a little hole in it, and so you're not wasting water by sprinkling water and then much of it evaporates. You just have a drop, drop, drip, drip, drip all day long, and that allows for the maximum utilization of water resources. But having said all that, it's a tiny country and there's many microclimates. I live here at 800 meters high. Of course, sea level is 0, and there's a big difference between that. So that allows for different, even though it's a tiny country, it allows for different growing zones, different agricultural zones. And we see that, for example, in the wine business. There are many terroirs, from the deserts to the mountains to the coastal plains, and they each produce their own specialized vintage. Most of the food in Israel is grown domestically.
Gil, I believe Jerusalem is the food in Jerusalem is you give huge variety of food available. Can you talk to us? There are a lot of foodies amongst us. We'd like to know about the kind of cuisine that Israel and Jerusalem has to offer.
Well, it's a very international city that you can get anything here, but I would say that Middle Eastern cuisine is dominating. So people often eat hummus, ground chickpeas with bread every day. Olive oil is a big part of the diet. Many people are vegetarians. Some of them will eat meat on the Sabbath, on Friday, but either for reasons they can't afford it, or for spiritual reasons they're semi-vegetarians. I was asked as well about the kibbutz. So for the same reason that many people here turning poverty into a virtue, the kibbutz in 1909, that's when it was founded, the first kibbutz, is a socialist movement amongst people who have very limited resources. And in order to get the maximum labor value out of their people, they've specialized in everything. So children are not brought up originally by their families. They're placed in a children's home, freeing their parents to contribute more to the socialist or even communist economy. But having said that, that really runs against human nature. I think people want to be both connected and living as masters of their own destiny and their own family. The kibbutz never became terribly popular. Never more than 4% of the country accepted kibbutzim. So over time, this idea of agriculture was surpassed by industry. And today, kibbutzim are, if you wish, country clubs. They're gated communities with swimming pools, and they're privatized. You're a member, and you pay for any services, water, electricity, renting a car, whatever you use, you pay for. So today, the kibbutz actually has become quite fashionable because it offers a very high standard of living when you share your resources.
Yes.
Yeah, Joel wants to add.
Can I ask a question, President?
I'm not sure if this is
spices. Wow.
I'm not sure if this is inverted on your screen or not, but this is a book by a herbal healer. It's available on Amazon. I'll post the link at the end. And this is a woman who's descended from the tribe of Levi. Her name's Shoshana Harari, and she lives with her husband about 20 minutes outside of Jerusalem. They make handmade harps that were the same harps that were used 3,000 years ago in the temple of King David. And they're a family. They have a workshop, they have a farm, and they're devoted to the rebuilding of this temple. They're both from the same tribe, goes back 3,000 years. Anyway, this book is filled with, there were 7 species? Yeah. There's what are known as the 7 species of Israel. But in this book, there's wisdom from all the traditions, and it goes over different recipes from the land. And there's quotes from many of the world faiths about wisdom and healing. So I'll post the link at the end. It's a wonderful resource for foodies.
May I ask a question, President?
Who's this?
Anil Ambo.
Yeah, Anil.
Jill, you mentioned that 3 religions, very important religions, are coexisting in harmony. what lessons can you share for India where the communalism and the kind of religious fights take place? So what's the lesson that you would share with India? Because they're coexisting together.
Yes. Well, I have to say, first of all, it's not perfect harmony, but people do get along. So perhaps some of you have seen the movie Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg. And Oskar Schindler, he's the only member of the Nazi Party who saved Jews in the Holocaust. And he's buried on the Mount of Olives, on Mount Zion, excuse me, in the Franciscan cemetery. So here we have a non-believing person buried in a Franciscan cemetery, and the person who buried him, I interviewed him. He's a Muslim peasant, and he dug the grave. He buried Oskar Schindler, and I asked him, "What do you make of this?" And he said, "Kulna nichna bani Allah. We're all the children of Allah." So I think if we can all understand there's only one universal God, however you want to describe him or her, if we can all see ourselves as one, then we can all make space for each other if we can respect each other.
Thank you.
Very well said. I think it's a lesson for all of us. If there are no more questions, yeah, Manoj, any more questions?
Yeah, I have one question. Anil Kamath.
Anilji, please.
Gil, I find that from healthcare, hospitals, and medical devices, Israel comes out to be possibly one of the world's most advanced in technologies.
Yes.
How did this happen for a small country?
Indeed.
So advanced in these areas.
Yes, I recommend the book Startup Nation by, do you remember Singer? Doesn't matter. Startup Nation, but Israel in 1947, 48, and Israel and India are in the same position. We're overwhelmed by poverty and refugees from war, and we have very limited infrastructure. So one of the results of this is the country becomes dependent on the army, on the Israel Defense Forces, and you have these 18-year-old conscripts, and they're being given a lot of responsibility, and they're being forced to make decisions. This creates the entrepreneurial framework which has allowed Israel to become the startup nation. So this is, of course, in many fields, certainly in defense, in computers, and in agriculture, but you mentioned medicine. So yeah, Israel is a very high-tech place. I might add in spying and espionage.
Gil, yeah, thanks a lot. Gil, what is the situation there now? And the pandemic in Bombay is crazy at the moment. How about at your end?
Yes, look, this is a global pandemic. I think it arrived in the Middle East earlier than in India. So we're in the middle of it, and the number of deaths has gone down a lot. We're at 300 deaths, but we may be at the beginning of a second wave now. The government keeps postponing the reopening of railroads, for example. All the railroads are shut. All the museums are shut. They've opened schools, and now they've shut them again. I wish I share some good news with you, but this is a very difficult situation, and I really encourage everybody to take it very seriously for your sake, for your children's sake, to keep social distance and to follow government regulations.
Yeah, we all hope the world over that this gets over soon and we are back to normal, and maybe a time comes when we as Rotary members can visit Jerusalem.
And then I want to come to India again.
Exactly. Thank you so much.